Theodore Dalton had served eviction papers on drunkards, deadbeats, and men who deserved every hard word that came with them. But he had never done it while a woman held a shotgun steady on his chest from the porch of a cabin she had clearly built with her own hands. "Get off my land, Marshal," Louisa Ford said, and the barrel did not waver even a little. "I don't care what paper you're carrying." "Deputy Marshal," he corrected, because it seemed important to be exact about a thing when a woman was aiming a greener at your heart. "And I am obliged by law to deliver this notice into your hand, ma'am. I'd take it kindly if you'd let me do that without either of us getting shot over it." It was the second week of October, 1883, and the aspens above the Ford homestead had turned the color of struck matches, gold and orange running up the slopes of the Sangre de Cristo foothills until they met the first gray stone of the high peaks. The air smelled of piñon smoke and cold coming early. Theodore had ridden 2 days from Santa Fe to reach this fold of the New Mexico territory, where the high desert gave way to timber and creek water. And in all that riding, he had not once considered that the widow he'd been sent to evict might be young, might be handsome in a wind-burned, capable way, might hold a shotgun like she'd been born with it in her hands. "I know what the paper says," Louisa told him. "The Territorial Cattle and Land Company claims my husband owed a debt against this homestead, and since he's 2 years in the ground and can't argue otherwise, they mean to take what he died proving up. I have read it. I have burned 2 copies of it already. I do not need a third read to know it for a lie." "That may be, ma'am, but a lie with a judge's seal on it still has to be answered in a courtroom, not on a porch." "Then let it go answer itself in a courtroom. Get off my land." Theodore did not get off her land. He sat his horse, a big rawbone bay named Samson, and studied her a moment the way he studied any witness he needed to understand before he could do right by them. She was maybe 28 or 29, sun-browned, sturdy through the shoulders in the way of women who worked cattle and split wood, and did not have the luxury of being fragile. Her dark hair was pulled back hard beneath a battered hat that had probably once belonged to a man. Behind her, past the porch, he could see a homestead put together with real care, a cabin with a good stone chimney, a barn raised true and square, corrals mended tight, a kitchen garden gone brown with frost but clearly tended all summer. This was not the place of a woman who had let her husband's death undo her. This was the place of a woman who had kept building after the building should have stopped. "Mrs. Ford," he said, and he made himself use a gentler voice, the one he used on grieving families and frightened children. "I've got a duty here I don't relish. But I've also got questions about this notice that I mean to ask, and I can't ask them from the far side of a shotgun." She did not lower the gun, but something in her eyes shifted, some crack of curiosity working through the anger. "What questions?" "For one, the lien this claims against your land is dated for a debt supposedly incurred in the spring of '81. Your husband's name is on it as debtor, but the signature witnessing the debt belongs to a county clerk who I happen to know was not appointed to that office until the fall of '82. A man can't witness a paper a year before he holds the job that lets him witness papers." The shotgun came down, not all the way, but enough that the muzzle pointed at the porch boards instead of his chest. "Say that again," Louisa said. "The clerk's commission wasn't official until October of '82. This lien is dated April of '81. Somebody backdated it or forged it whole cloth and did a sloppy job besides." He reached slow into his coat, produced the folded paper, and held it out, not stepping down from Samson, letting her come to it instead. "I am still required by the letter of my orders to place this notice in your hand, Mrs. Ford. That much I cannot get out of. But I did not ride 2 days through the mountains to hand a widow a forgery and call it justice." She came down off the porch steps then, shotgun broken open over her arm the way a person carries a tool rather than a threat, and took the paper from him with fingers that trembled slightly, though her voice did not. "You're the first lawman who's looked twice at anything that companies put in front of him," she said. "Every other one just delivers and rides on. I intend to look a great deal more than twice, Theodore said, because there's a second matter, ma'am, that brought me out here besides this notice, and it concerns you directly. She looked up at him, wary again but listening. Judge Horace Whitfield, out of the territorial court in Santa Fe, has had complaints piling up on his desk for the better part of a year. Small ranchers all through this county losing cattle to brand alterations, losing land to liens that appear out of nowhere, all of it running back through the Territorial Cattle and Land Company, and a man named Silas Crane. The judge means to bring a fraud case against Crane's whole outfit, but he needs evidence that will hold up, and he needs it before the snow closes the passes. Word reached him that your late husband kept detailed brand and tally records, better than most, right up until he died. If those records still exist, Mrs. Ford, they may be the difference between Crane answering for what he's done and Crane walking free to do it to the next widow down the valley. Louisa was quiet a long moment, the wind moving through the yellow aspens above them, a horse stamping somewhere in the barn. Daniel kept every book he ever owned like his life depended on getting the numbers right, she said finally. Turned out it was worth more than his life. It might be worth something to somebody else's now. She folded the false eviction notice once, hard, like she was folding away an insult. You'd best come in, Deputy Marshal. If I'm going to be told my home isn't mine by a piece of paper some crooked clerk backdated, I want to know exactly what else that company has been putting its false hand to. It was, Theodore would think later, the moment the whole shape of his errand changed. From a man delivering bad news to a man discovering. He had ridden 2 days to do wrong by a woman who deserved a great deal better than wrong. The cabin was warmer than he expected and smelled of coffee and drying sage. A shelf along one wall held a run of ledgers bound in dark leather, their spines cracked from handling, and Louisa took the newest one down and set it on the table between them like she was laying down evidence at her own trial. Daniel bought and sold cattle for half the ranches in this valley before we ever homesteaded here, she said. He kept records the way some men keep scripture. Every brand, every count, every sale, cross-referenced against the county's own registry so nobody could claim he'd shorted them. After he passed, I kept it up. Seemed disrespectful to let a habit like that die with him. She opened the ledger to a page dated the previous spring and turned it so Theodore could read the careful, slanting hand. Columns of numbers, brand sketches inked with a precision that surprised him, notes in the margins about weather and water and which bull had thrown good calves. Here, she said, tapping a line. 40 head sold off the Ray's place, branded with the Ray's iron, a J-hook over a bar, recorded here in March. Then look at this. She flipped forward 3 months to a page of her own, more recent notation. Same 40 head, near as I can count them by markings and age, show up on the county tax rolls in June carrying the Crane Outfits brand, a rafter C, like they'd always worn it. But a rafter C burned fresh over a J-hook leaves a scar pattern. I've seen it on strays that wandered back onto my land. You can see the old brand ghosted underneath if you know to look. You're saying Crane's men are running a rebranding operation, Theodore said slowly, buying nothing, stealing outright, and covering it by altering brands and then bribing or forcing the county into updating the tax rolls to match the theft. I'm saying I believe that, yes. And I believe the same company that's stealing cattle from the Ray's place and the Alvarez place and half a dozen others is the same company that just tried to steal my home with a lie dated a year before the man who supposedly witnessed it held his office. Louisa closed the ledger, but kept her hand flat on its cover, protective. The trouble is believing a thing and proving it in a courtroom are not the same animal, Deputy Marshal. No, ma'am, they are not. But a judge with a paper trail like this, and a witness willing to testify to what she's seen with her own eyes, gets a great deal closer to proving than a judge with nothing but complaints and rumor. Theodore sat back, turning his hat slowly in his hands, a habit from thinking hard. Judge Whitfield's orders were for me to serve this notice and separately to see if evidence existed worth escorting to Santa Fe before winter shut the high passes. I did not know, riding out here, that both orders would land on the same woman's porch. I am sorry for that, Mrs. Ford. Sorrier than I can rightly say. You deserved a knock on the door and an explanation, not a shotgun standoff. You'll get no argument from me that an apology was owed, Louisa said, but there was the ghost of something warmer in it now, almost amusement. I'll accept it, on the condition you help me make sure Silas Crane owes considerably more than an apology by the time this is finished. That, Theodore said, I believe I can arrange. Outside, the wind had picked up out of the northwest, and though the sky above the aspens still held that hard blue clarity of a mountain autumn, there was a taste in the air, faint but unmistakable to anyone who had spent seasons in that country, of weather building somewhere behind the peaks, waiting. They rode into Alma Springs the next morning, Louisa on a sturdy roan mare she called Biscuit, Theodore beside her on Samson, the ledger wrapped in oilcloth and tied secure behind her saddle. Alma Springs was not much of a town, a mercantile, a livery, a squat adobe church, a saloon with a false front too tall for the building behind it, and a scattering of houses climbing the slope toward the timber, but it was the only town for 30 miles, and its opinion mattered a great deal to the people who lived under its shadow. That opinion, Theodore would learn, could turn like weather. There's a boy I need to find first, Louisa said as they walked their horses down the single dusty street. Sam Whitcomb, 16 years old, worked for Crane's outfit as a wrangler until about 3 weeks back, when he came to my place in the middle of the night looking half sick with fright. Told me he'd watched 2 of Crane's men reburn a dozen head of Alvarez cattle down in the Pinon Wash, and that when he told his foreman he wanted no part of it, they told him he'd best forget what he saw or forget how to walk. He's been hiding in my hay loft since. He's exactly the kind of witness Judge Whitfield needs, Theodore said. Eyewitness to the act itself, not just the paper trail after. He's exactly the kind of witness who could get killed for saying so out loud, Louisa said. You'll forgive me if I don't hand him to you until I trust you a good deal further than one day's apology. I'd think less of you if you did, Theodore said, and meant it. They found the boy that evening back at the homestead, thin and jumpy, eyes too old for 16, and it took the better part of an hour of Louisa's steady talking and Theodore's quiet patience before Sam agreed that testifying before a territorial judge in Santa Fe, with a deputy marshal's protection the whole way, was safer than staying hidden in a hay loft waiting for Crane's men to think to look there. They'll know I'm gone within a day, Sam said, voice cracking. Foreman counts heads at the bunkhouse like he counts cattle. Then we'll be gone within the day too, Theodore said. Judge Whitfield's court sits in less than a week. If we leave at first light, keep good pace, we can make Santa Fe with days to spare, evidence and witness both delivered whole. He said it with more confidence than he entirely felt, because riding 2 grown adults and a frightened boy across 60 hard miles of territory controlled at every turn by a cattle syndicate with money enough to buy county clerks was not a thing any sensible lawman would call easy. But he had made a promise on Louisa Ford's porch to make Silas Crane owe more than an apology, and Theodore Dalton did not know how to make a promise and then not keep it. They left before dawn, 3 riders and a pack mule carrying provisions and the precious ledger, and behind them the aspens on the ridge burned gold in the first light, while somewhere far to the northwest, beyond sight, clouds the color of a bruise were gathering along the spine of the mountains, patient as a debt come due. The first 2 days of the ride passed with a wariness that slowly, mile by mile, wore down into something easier. Theodore found himself watching Louisa the way he might watch a good deputy, noting how she read the country ahead before he did, how she kept Sam talking about small things, his mother's cooking, a dog he'd left behind, anything but Crane's men, to keep the boy's mind off his fear. She rode like she'd been born to it, sat a horse the way some men only pretended to. "Your husband," Theodore said on the second evening, as they made a cold camp in a stand of ponderosa pine rather than risk a fire's glow being seen. "What happened to him, if you don't mind my asking?" Louisa was quiet a moment, working a knot out of a picket rope with quick, competent fingers. "Thrown from a green horse he had no business breaking alone 2 winters back. Broke his neck not 40 yards from the corral. I found him myself, come out to call him in for supper. She tied the rope off, tested it. We'd been on that homestead 3 years by then. 2 more to prove it up under the claim, and I meant to see it through if it killed me because it had very near killed him, and I was not going to let his dying be for nothing." "That's a hard kind of courage," Theodore said. "It's the only kind available to a widow with no family within 400 miles and a homestead claim that doesn't care whether you've got a husband or not, so long as the improvements get made and the years get served." She glanced at him, firelight from the banked coals catching the edge of her face. "What about you, Deputy Marshal? A man doesn't get to your age without some story behind him." "Cavalry, before the badge. Rode with the 9th out of Fort Union for a spell, after the war, chasing raiders and worse. Saw enough of men doing wrong under color of orders that, when I put on this badge, I promised myself I'd never serve a paper I hadn't looked at twice." He almost smiled. "Until 3 days ago when I very nearly rode onto your land and did exactly that." "You looked twice in time," Louisa said. "That counts for something." "It counts for a start," Theodore said. "I mean to do considerably better than a start before this is finished." Sam, wrapped in a blanket a few feet off, pretended to be asleep, but Theodore caught the boy's small smile before he closed his eyes, the smile of someone young enough to still find comfort in watching 2 adults circle toward something neither of them was ready to name. It was on the 3rd day, coming down out of the high timber toward the river crossing at a settlement called Piedra Seca, that the trouble Theodore had been half expecting finally caught up with them. 4 riders came out of a dry arroyo where the trail narrowed between rock walls, and Theodore knew them for Crane's men before a word was spoken, by the quality of their horses and the studied casualness of men who meant business dressed up as men who didn't. "Afternoon, Deputy," the lead rider said. A broad man with a droopy mustache and a badge of his own, a private company badge, not a territorial one, though he wore it like it carried the same weight. "Name's Boone Hardesty, ride for the Territorial Cattle and Land Company. We heard you might be escorting some property of ours west." "I'm escorting a witness and evidence in a territorial fraud investigation," Theodore said, keeping his voice level, his hand loose and ready near his hip. "Nothing on this trail belongs to your company, Mr. Hardesty. That boy back there rode for us not a month past. Company property don't just walk off." "A man's not property in this territory, Mr. Hardesty, company or otherwise, and you do well to remember that before you say it in front of a federal officer." Hardesty's eyes flicked to Louisa, to the oilcloth-wrapped bundle behind her saddle, and something calculating crossed his face. "Mrs. Ford, didn't figure you for keeping company with lawmen these days." "I'll keep whatever company gets Sela's Crane in front of a judge," Louisa said, and her hand had drifted unhurried to the stock of the rifle in her saddle scabbard. "That's a hard thing to hear," Hardesty said, "seeing as how we were hoping to persuade you all to turn back toward Alma Springs, real friendly-like, and let this whole misunderstanding settle itself out without any paperwork reaching Santa Fe." "There will be no turning back," Theodore said. "Ride on, Mr. Hardesty, or I'll have cause to arrest you for obstructing a federal officer in the performance of his duty, and I promise you the charge will stick considerably better than that lien your outfit tried to put on Mrs. Ford's homestead." For a long, taut moment nobody moved, the wind hissing through the piñon on the canyon walls, Sam's breathing gone shallow and fast behind them. Then Hardesty's mustache twitched in something like a smile, ugly and unhurried. "Boys," he said, "seems the deputy wants to do this the hard way." What followed happened fast and rough, and was over inside a minute. Hardesty's men spurring forward, Theodore's Colt clearing leather almost before the first shot was fired wide over their heads as warning, Louisa wheeling Biscuit hard to put her body between the riders and Sam while her rifle came up smooth and sure. A shot that took the hat clean off the nearest rider's head close enough to make the point without making a killing. "Next one's lower," she called out, voice iron steady. "And I don't miss twice." It was enough. Men paid to intimidate a woman and a boy were not generally men paid to die for the privilege. And after a few more tense seconds of shouting and horses wheeling in the narrow arroyo, Hardesty spat, called his men back, and gave Theodore a look promising this was not finished. "Tell Crane," Theodore called after them as they rode off, "that Judge Whitfield's court sits in 4 days, and I intend to be there with everything I came for." When the dust settled and Sam's shaking had eased into something manageable, Theodore turned to find Louisa already reloading her rifle, hands steady, jaw set. "You didn't tell me you could shoot like that," he said. "You didn't ask," she said, but there was a flicker of something pleased beneath the steel of her, and Theodore found himself grinning despite the danger they had just ridden through, because he had not laughed easily and longer than he cared to admit, and something about this woman made it come loose in him anyway. "Remind me," he said, "never to threaten your homestead again." "I'll remind you of a great many things, Deputy Marshal, before this is through," Louisa said, and turned Biscuit back toward the trail, and Theodore, watching her go, felt something shift and settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the badge on his coat and everything to do with the woman wearing it like she'd earned the right to be dangerous. Pedra Seca turned out to be a rougher welcome than the arroyo had been, though the danger there wore a different face. They rode into the little settlement expecting to water the horses and buy what supplies the single trading post could spare, and found instead a knot of men gathered outside the post, faces hard, and a telegraph operator standing among them looking uncomfortable in the manner of a man who has delivered news he wishes he hadn't. "That's him," one of the men said, low but not low enough. "Deputy Dalton. Word come down the wire this morning from the county seat. Says he's gone rogue, run off with a widow's cattle ledgers and a boy that don't belong to him, headed for Santa Fe to sell false evidence to line his own pocket against an honest company." Theodore reined up short, disbelief giving way fast to a cold, sinking understanding. Crane had not wasted any time. "That is a lie," he said, loud enough to carry, "put out by the very company this evidence will convict." "Says here," the telegraph man said, apologetic but unwilling to back down from what he'd read, "that the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe is disavowing your actions, deputy, on account of you exceeding your assigned duty by kidnapping a minor and misappropriating private ledgers under false pretense of a fraud investigation. Judge Whitfield himself ordered this," Theodore said. "I have his written instruction in my saddlebag." "Anybody can carry a paper," another man muttered, and the crowd's mood, already primed by whatever wire Crane's people had sent ahead, curdled further, a few hands drifting toward holsters, nobody quite committing to violence but nobody backing down either. Louisa's hand found Theodore's arm, quick and steadying. "Not here," she said quietly. "Not with Sam standing right behind us. We ride through, we don't stop to argue with men who have already decided what they believe." It cost Theodore something to do it. Every instinct in him wanted to stand and answer the lie plain, badge to badge. But he had spent enough years as a lawman to know that a crowd primed with suspicion and half-truths was not a jury, and there was no verdict to win from them that afternoon, only a fight that would help nobody. "We'll water the horses at the creek a mile on," he said, low, and turned Samson's head, and they rode through the gathered men slow and steady, Louisa's rifle held loose but visible across her saddle, Sam white-faced between them, until the settlement fell behind and the trail climbed back into the trees. "They believed it," Theodore said once they were well clear, the words coming out rougher than he intended. "Just like that. A wire from Crane's people in half a town decides I'm a thief and a kidnapper. People believe what's easiest," Louisa said. "It was always going to be easier for them to believe a company that pays half their debts and buys half their goods than a lawman they only just met. That's not a mark against you, Theodore. It's a mark against how this territory's been run for the last 5 years. Letting money buy the truth, same as it buys cattle. It was the first time she had used his given name, and he noticed it the way a man notices the first warm day after a hard winter. "It'll matter in Santa Fe," he said. "It has to. Judge Whitfield knows what he ordered." "It will matter," Louisa agreed. "Once we've got the proof laid out plain enough that nobody with a lick of sense can call it a lie twice. Until then, we ride and we watch our backs, and we don't let a telegraph wire decide who we are." They made camp that night in silence for a long while. The weight of the day settled heavy over the small fire, Sam already asleep, exhausted past his fear. Theodore sat with his coffee gone cold in his hand, staring at nothing, and Louisa, after a time, came and sat beside him, closer than strict propriety might have called for, though out here, 3 people and 60 hard miles from anywhere, propriety had already bent considerably. "You're troubled," she said. "I have spent my whole career believing that if a man does his job honest, the truth eventually stands up for itself," Theodore said. "Today I watched a town decide I was a criminal on the strength of a lie sent faster than I could ride. Makes a man wonder what the badge is even for if the law can be outrun by a telegraph. The badge is for the days the truth needs somebody standing next to it, holding it up until it can stand on its own," Louisa said. "That's all it's ever been for. Daniel used to say a fair scale doesn't weigh anything by itself. Somebody's got to set it level and watch it, or it'll always tip toward whoever's got a thumb heavy enough to press it down." Theodore looked at her then, really looked. The firelight soft on the strong line of her jaw, the steadiness in her that had not once cracked despite 2 years of grief, and now a company's whole machinery bent toward taking what little she had left. "You are the most remarkable woman I believe I have ever met, Louisa Ford," he said, quiet, honest, the words out before he'd fully decided to say them. She did not look away, and did not pretend not to hear the weight in it. "That is a dangerous thing to tell a widow you've known for days, Deputy Marshal." "I've served papers on men I've known 4 minutes and felt like I understood them entire," Theodore said. "4 days with you has taught me I understood nothing at all, about a great many things, until I met you." For a moment neither of them spoke, the fire cracking, the mountain night pressing close and cold around the small warm circle of their camp, and something passed between them that was not quite a promise yet but was no longer nothing either. "We should sleep," Louisa said finally, though she did not move away right away. "We've a river to cross tomorrow, and I don't like the look that sky's been wearing since noon." She was right to be wary. What neither of them could know, bedding down that night beneath a sky still bright with stars, was that the storm gathering unseen behind the western peaks had been building for 2 days over country too high and too far to be seen from the trail, and that by midday tomorrow it would come down off the mountains with a violence the bright autumn morning gave no warning of at all. They reached the Rio Pinto crossing at Pedra Seca's outlying trestle just past noon the next day, and Theodore did not like what he saw. The Rio Pinto ran high already, swollen brown and fast from rains higher in the mountains that had not yet reached them but had clearly reached the river's source, and the crossing itself was a narrow trestle bridge of hand-hewn timber and rope lashing, built years back by ranchers on both banks who needed a way across during the spring melt and had never much trusted the ford lower down. It swayed slightly even in the wind, 100 feet of planking strung between 2 rock outcrops above a gorge where the water churned white over boulders 20 feet below. "We could go around," Sam said, voice tight, staring at the water. "Down to the low ford." "Low ford will be worse than this in a river running this high," Louisa said. "This bridge is old, but it's held through worse seasons than this one, near as I remember. We cross quick and we cross now, before whatever's feeding that water upstream gets worse instead of better." Theodore studied the sky to the west, where clouds the color of a fresh bruise had begun climbing over the peaks with a speed that made his stomach tighten. "She's right that we shouldn't wait. Sam, you cross first, quick and steady, don't look down. Louisa, then you, and I'll bring the horses and the mule across last." They started across in careful order, the bridge groaning under each step, boards worn smooth and slick from years of weather. Sam made the far bank without incident, breathing hard with relief, and Louisa started across behind him, leading Biscuit by the bridle, the precious ledger still lashed secure behind the saddle. She was perhaps 2/3 of the way across when the first board gave way behind her with a crack like a rifle shot. Theodore, still on the near bank steadying Samson and the pack mule, saw it happen almost too fast to process, the plank snapping under Biscuit's rear hoof, the mare screaming and lurching sideways, Louisa thrown hard against the rope railing, which held for one terrible instant and then began, plank by plank, rope by fraying rope, to come apart beneath the sudden violent surge of water rising against the trestle's old supports. Louisa. Theodore was already moving, dropping Samson's lead, sprinting onto the shuddering bridge even as it bucked beneath his boots. "Get back!" she shouted, one arm hooked hard around the rope rail, the other still gripping Biscuit's bridle as the terrified mare fought to find footing on planks that were disappearing beneath her one by one, falling away into the roaring brown water below. The whole thing's going. It was going. Theodore could feel it in the boards under his own feet, a slow, terrible unraveling, and he understood with the cold clarity of a man out of time that there was no reaching her before the bridge finished collapsing beneath them both. He did the only thing left to do. He dropped flat, drove his boot heels hard into a gap between two planks to anchor himself, and unspooled the coil of hemp rope he carried always at his saddle horn, thrown clear when Samson had reared no. It was still on the saddle, too far. He tore instead at the length of picket rope looped across his own chest from that morning's camp, fingers working desperate and fast, and flung the loop out across the widening gap of collapsing bridge just as another support rope parted with a crack like a gunshot, and the whole center span dropped a sickening 2 feet in an instant. "Catch it! Louisa, catch it now!" She let go of Biscuit's bridle had to. There was no other way, and the mare, screaming, half fell, half scrambled off the disintegrating edge of the span, and somehow, by animal instinct and desperate luck, found enough purchase on a last intact section to lunge for the far bank, dragging herself up onto solid ground even as the ledger bundle on her saddle came half untied and nearly slid free. Louisa's hand closed on the rope Theodore had thrown a half-second before the plank beneath her gave way entirely. For one endless moment she hung suspended over the roaring gorge, nothing beneath her but white water and jagged stone, her whole weight dragging against Theodore's grip on the rope, and Theodore felt his own anchor point. The plank his boots were braced against begin to splinter under the strain. "I've got you," he ground out, teeth gritted, arms burning, hauling hand over hand though every part of the bridge around him was tearing itself apart. "I've got you, Louisa. Don't let go." "I wasn't planning to," she gasped, and even now, even swinging above a drop that would have killed her outright, there was steel in her voice instead of panic, and she began, with a strength that astonished him, to help walking her boots up the rock face of the near outcrop that the bridge's ruined end still clung to, working with him instead of only being pulled, until between his hauling and her climbing, she came up over the broken edge of the span and collapsed against him. Both of them scrambling backward off the last shuddering timbers, just as the final support gave way entirely, and the whole ruined middle of the bridge fell away into the river with a roar that seemed to shake the ground itself. They lay tangled together on solid rock at the bridge's near end, both of them soaked with spray, chests heaving, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all because there was nothing to say that could match the size of what had almost happened. "Sam," Theodore finally managed, pushing up on one arm, scanning the far bank. "He's there," Louisa said, still breathless, pointing. "He's fine. Bridge held long enough for him." Across the churning gap, Sam stood on the far bank with Biscuit's reins clutched in white-knuckled hands. The ledger, thank God, the ledger, still tied secure to the mare's saddle, shaken loose but not lost. He was shouting something that the roar of the water swallowed whole, and Theodore raised a hand to show they were unhurt, watched some of the boys' terror ease into visible relief. Louisa was still pressed against Theodore's side, and he became abruptly, sharply aware of her breath against his neck, the way her hand had fisted into the front of his coat and had not yet let go, the closeness of her after the terror of nearly losing her entirely. "You could have died just now," he said, low, rough. "Trying to save that ledger, trying to save that horse. You very near went into that river." "You could have died pulling me out of it," she said, and pulled back just enough to look at him, and whatever careful distance either of them had been keeping since that first shotgun confrontation on her porch simply was not there anymore, washed away as thoroughly as the bridge. "You didn't hesitate, Theodore. Not for 1 second. I wasn't going to lose you," he said, and it came out with none of the careful lawman's caution he usually kept around his own feelings. "Not to that river, not to Crane, not to anything. I have known you 4 days, Louisa Ford, and I would have gone into that gorge after you without a second thought, and that has never once happened to me before with any living soul, and I don't rightly know what to do with that except tell you it's true." Louisa's eyes were bright, whether from the spray or something else he could not tell, and she reached up and touched his jaw, gentle, wondering, like she was confirming he was real and whole and there. "I don't know what to do with it either," she said softly. "Except I don't want to do anything except keep you close while I figure it out." He kissed her then, there on the wet rock above the ruined bridge with the river roaring below and the storm finally breaking loose overhead in a cold, hard rain. And it was not a careful kiss, not a first timid taste of something new, but the kind of kiss that came from 2 people who had each nearly lost the other and found, in the space of one held breath, that losing was the thing neither of them could bear. They found a way around, eventually. A longer, harder ride south to a narrower crossing where the water ran shallower over gravel instead of gorge, adding the better part of a day to their journey, soaked through and exhausted and down one bridge but not, thank God, down a witness or a widow or a lawman. Sam, reunited with them after a tense hour of shouted directions across the gorge and a long ride around, could not stop talking about the collapse for an hour afterward, the particular breathless chatter of a boy who has just watched adults survive something enormous and is still working out how to hold the size of it. They reached Santa Fe on the 5th day, later than planned but not too late, riding into the territorial capital road-worn and rain-battered, Sam wide-eyed at the adobe walls and the bustle of the plaza, Louis's ledger dry and intact inside its oilcloth, and Theodore carrying himself like a man who had a very great deal riding on the next 24 hours, which he did, in more ways than one. Judge Horace Whitfield's chambers occupied a plain adobe building off the plaza, and the judge himself, when Theodore was finally shown in, proved to be a lean, gray-whiskered man with sharp eyes that missed very little. "Deputy Dalton," Whitfield said, not rising, "I have received a most colorful wire from the county seat accusing you of kidnapping, theft, and general malfeasance in the performance of your duties. I confess I did not expect you to actually appear in my office rather than run for the Texas line. I have with me, Your Honor, the evidence you sent me to retrieve," Theodore said, and set the ledger on the judge's desk, along with an eyewitness to the Territorial Cattle and Land Company's brand alteration scheme, and Mrs. Louisa Ford, the homesteader whose land the same company attempted to seize with a forged lien dated a year before the witnessing clerk held his office. Whitfield's sharp eyes moved from Theodore to the ledger to Louisa, standing straight-backed and steady in the doorway despite 5 hard days on the trail, and something in his weathered face sharpened with interest. "Sit," the judge said. "All of you. I find I would very much like to hear this told properly, from the beginning, before I decide whose version of events this office is going to believe." It took the better part of 2 hours, Louisa laying out her ledger page by page with the same precision her husband had taught her, Sam haltingly but clearly describing what he had witnessed in the Pinon Wash, Theodore presenting Hardesty's attempted intimidation on the trail, and the forged commission date on the eviction lien. And by the end of it, Judge Whitfield sat back in his chair with the particular stillness of a man who has just seen a puzzle complete itself. "This is," he said finally, "considerably more thorough than anything Silas Crane's lawyers have managed to muster in their own defense, and I will tell you plainly, Deputy Dalton, that the wire accusing you of malfeasance was sent by Crane's own clerk not 4 hours after my original orders left this office, which tells me a great deal about how closely that company monitors this court's business, and none of it good." He tapped the ledger. "I am satisfied there is more than sufficient cause here to bring formal fraud charges against Silas Crane and the Territorial Cattle and Land Company, to void the lien against the Ford homestead as the forgery it plainly is, and to order a full accounting of every brand altered under that company's authority these past 3 years, with restitution due to every rancher defrauded." "And my reputation, Your Honor?" Theodore asked. "Half of Piedraseca believes I'm a thief." "Half of Piedraseca will believe whatever the next wire tells them to believe, until they see otherwise with their own eyes," Whitfield said. "Which is why I intend to hold this hearing in open court, publicly, with Mr. Crane and his lawyers present to answer for themselves, and I intend to see to it that word of the outcome travels considerably faster and wider than that first lie did. Justice that only happens in a judge's chambers isn't worth much to the people who need to see it done, Deputy. You'll have your reputation back, but you'll earn it back in public, same as it was taken from you in public. That's simply how these things work, and you know it as well as I do." He was right, and Theodore knew it, and 3 days later, in a courtroom packed with ranchers from half the county, the Alvarez family, the Reyeses, a dozen others who had lost cattle and land to Crane's schemes over the years, Silas Crane sat pale and cornered while Louisa Ford's ledger was read into the territorial record, while Sam Whitcomb, steadier now with so many friendly faces around him, described what he had seen in the wash, while the forged commission date was laid bare for the whole room to see. Crane's lawyers tried what they could, but a forged date does not argue itself out of existence, and by the time Judge Whitfield delivered his ruling, the lien void, the eviction quashed, fraud charges bound over for territorial trial, a full accounting and restitution ordered against the company's assets, the mood in that courtroom had turned entirely, and it was Theodore Dalton the ranchers came to shake by the hand afterward, not Silas Crane's lawyers. Word did travel, just as the judge had promised, faster and further than the first lie, carried back along the same wires and the same trails by men who had sat in that courtroom and seen the truth laid out plain. By the time Theodore, Louisa, and Sam rode back into Piedraseca a week later, the same men who had stood outside the trading post, ready to believe a wire over a badge, came out instead to shake Theodore's hand and offer apologies of their own, awkward and sincere. And one of them, the telegraph operator, went so far as to buy the whole party supper at his own expense, calling it a debt owed for having believed too quick and thought too little. "Reckon I owe you an apology of my own, Deputy," the man said. "Ought to have known better than to trust a company wire over a lawman standing right in front of me." "You're not the only one who's owed apologies in this business," Theodore said, glancing at Louisa across the table, and she smiled and did not need to say anything at all. Alma Springs, when they finally rode back into it, greeted them like conquering heroes, which embarrassed Theodore considerably and seemed to amuse Louisa a great deal. The territorial court, in the weeks that followed, moved with unusual speed against the territorial cattle and land companies' remaining assets. Cattle recovered and returned to their rightful ranchers, where brands could be sorted out. Land fraudulently liened restored to its owners. Silas Crane himself bound over for trial in Santa Fe on charges that would likely see him spend a long stretch of years somewhere considerably less comfortable than his company office. There remained the matter of the reward. Judge Whitfield's court, in recognition of the evidence recovered and the fraud exposed, authorized a substantial sum, several $1,000s, drawn from Crane's forfeited assets, to be paid to those most responsible for bringing the scheme to light. A clerk from the territorial office rode out to Alma Springs specifically to deliver the news, finding Theodore and Louisa together, as had become their custom in the weeks since their return, working side by side mending the Ford homestead's fences before the first real snow came down off the peaks. $3,000, the clerk said, clearly expecting this news to be received with considerable joy, to be split between Deputy Dalton and Mrs. Ford in recognition of services rendered to the territorial court. Theodore looked at Louisa. Louisa looked at Theodore. Something passed between them that needed no words, the same understanding that had grown between them across 5 hard days on the trail and every day since. "We'll not be taking it," Louisa said. The clerk blinked. "Ma'am." "Not for ourselves," Theodore clarified. "But I expect this county could use a proper bridge at the Piedra Seca crossing, one that won't come apart under a woman, and a horse the next time the river runs high. And Alma Springs has needed a schoolhouse longer than anybody's willing to admit, seeing as the nearest one's a day's ride off and half the children in this valley have never sat in a classroom in their lives." "You want the reward money spent on a bridge and a schoolhouse," the clerk said slowly, as though checking he'd heard right. "We want it spent on the people who lived through Crane's thieving and never got a courtroom to make it right," Louisa said. "The Alvarez family, the Reyeses, all the small outfits that lost cattle and had no ledger to prove it, and on the next widow or the next boy, who might need a safe bridge to cross or a school to learn his letters in, so he grows up knowing how to read a lien well enough not to be cheated by one." She glanced at Theodore, something soft and certain in her face. "We came out of this with considerably more than money already." The clerk, to his credit, did not argue further, only noted it down and rode back to Santa Fe shaking his head in a manner that suggested he did not entirely understand people who turned down $3,000 but respected it all the same. The bridge went up before the heavy snows came, sturdier this time, stone-anchored where the old one had relied on rope and hope, and the schoolhouse foundation was laid before winter closed the ground entire, ready to raise its walls come spring. The whole valley turned out for both projects, ranchers who had lost cattle to Crane working alongside ranchers who never had, united now in a way the fear and suspicion of the syndicate years had never allowed, and Theodore found himself, more often than not these days, working beside Louisa on one project or another. The two of them falling into an easy partnership that had stopped feeling temporary sometime around the moment he had pulled her off a collapsing bridge and could not imagine letting her go again. It was Louisa, in the end, who said the thing neither of them had quite managed to say plain, one evening in late November with the first snow just beginning to dust the aspen ridges white, the two of them sitting on the porch where he had once faced down her shotgun, a fire going warm inside the cabin behind them. "You've been finding excuses to ride out here 3-4 times a week since Santa Fe," she said, not looking at him, working a knot out of a length of rope with the same competent hands that had once held a rifle steady on his chest. "Marshal's business doesn't require a man mend fences and split wood for a homestead that isn't his to keep." "No," Theodore agreed. "It doesn't. So why do you keep doing it?" He was quiet a moment, watching the snow settle soft and silent over the yard, the barn, the corrals mended tight against the coming winter, all of it built and rebuilt by a woman who had refused to let grief or greed or a forged lien take from her what she'd earned with her own 2 hands. "Because I came to this homestead to serve you papers that would have taken it all away," he said finally. "And instead I found the truest, bravest, most remarkable person I have ever known, and I have spent every day since trying to work up the nerve to tell her that I don't want to ride away from this place, ever, unless it's beside her and not apart from her." He turned to face her fully. "I owe you an apology still, Louisa. Not for the notice, that's long settled, but for every day since Santa Fe that I've let you wonder whether I meant to stay or go, when the truth is I decided somewhere on that broken bridge that I was never going to willingly leave your side again. I should have said it plainer sooner." Louisa set the rope down. "I have been waiting a long while for you to catch up to what I already knew," she said, but her voice was not steady the way it usually was, warm and thick with feeling instead. "I love you, Theodore Dalton. I loved you somewhere around the time you threw yourself flat on a collapsing bridge without one moment's hesitation to save a woman you'd known 5 days, and I have not stopped since, and I do not intend to." "I love you," he said back, simple and certain, "and I would like, if you'll have me, to stop being a man who visits this homestead and become a man who lives on it. I've put in for a transfer, territorial marshal's office needs a deputy stationed permanent in this district anyway, given everything that's happened here. And I'd rather that deputy be a man who has a reason to stay besides the badge." "And if I said yes," Louisa said, "you understand this homestead is mine, proved up with my own hands and my own years, and I'll not be handing it to a husband to run as though I hadn't built every board of it myself." "I would not want it any other way," Theodore said. "I've watched you run this place better than most men I know run theirs. I'm not asking to take it from you, Louisa. I'm asking to help you keep building it, for as long as you'll let me, as your husband and your partner both, in whatever order you'd care to have them." She laughed then, a real laugh, bright in the cold evening air, and closed the distance between them and kissed him with a certainty that answered every question either of them might still have carried. They were married in the spring, once the passes cleared and the new schoolhouse stood finished with its first class of children filling the benches, in a small ceremony at the Alma Springs Church with half the valley in attendance. The Alvarez family, the Reyeses, Sam Whitcomb standing up as something between a witness and an adopted younger brother, grinning fit to burst, and even the telegraph operator from Pedra Seca, who brought a wedding gift of good coffee, and a story he told for years afterward about the deputy marshal and the widow who had ridden through a collapsing bridge, a corrupt cattle syndicate, and half a territory's worth of doubt to find each other on the other side of it. Theodore kept his badge, transferred permanent to the district as he'd promised, and rode a wide circuit through the mountain settlements and high desert ranches with a fairness earned hard through his own mistake and his own correction of it, never again serving a paper he had not looked at twice. Louisa kept her homestead, proved up entire and clear of any lien true or false, and expanded it in the coming years with a partnership she had chosen freely, on her own terms, with a man who had come to take her home away and stayed instead to help her build it larger. On autumns after that, when the aspens turned gold above the ranch and the first cold breath of coming snow moved down off the peaks, the two of them would sometimes ride out together to the new stone bridge at Pedra Seca, sturdy and sure beneath them where the old one had failed, and Louisa would tell it, when anyone asked, as the place where she had learned exactly what kind of man Theodore Dalton truly was, not the deputy who had come to serve her an eviction notice, but the one who had left. In the end, owing her an apology he'd paid in full 100 times over, and his whole heart besides, freely given and never once taken back.